That prayer. Notice you have on your chairs the next Kennedy Tech, which will be the 14th, and will feature Mark Chen, who is an entrepreneur from Hong Kong, as we try to get more and more of our people interested in the high-tech sector. So please pay attention to that flyer. We'd like to thank the Palmer family. They're up here in the front, okay, for their generous donation to this annual lecture. Thank you very much. Delbert Palmer helped establish the Canadian Studies program at BYU. And as far as we know, BYU has the largest enrollment of Canadian students among all universities in the United States. And today we will learn how the great-grandfather of many of the Palmer family who are gathered here today played an instrumental role in the development of agriculture in southern Alberta. We also have a seat over here, so any other seats free? We okay there? Right. The issue, of course, continues to be very important. California is beginning to ration water, but hopes to maintain the miracle of crop production in the Golden State. Much of the western U.S. and parts of the Canadian West are suffering from water shortages, plus aquifer and soil depletion. Keep in mind that the Canadian prairies and the U.S. West and Midwest are perhaps the two great breadbaskets of the entire world. Roughly 4/5 of all Canadians and Americans are urban dwellers and generally do not think about where their food comes from. However, 35 years from now, the global population is expected to expand from the current 7.2 billion to perhaps 9.6 billion people. How will they all receive the essential lifeline of nutritious food? Big, big question mark. Today we will hear from a man who grew up close to the soil on a small farm on the banks of the Milk River in southern Alberta. He then went on to earn a doctoral degree in soil science from the University of Saskatchewan. And for the past several years, he has worked as a research scientist for the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada Research Centre, an agency of the Government of Canada. Please welcome with me Dr. Benjamin H. Ellert.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here today, and I would like to thank the Palmer family for making this possible, and to thank Earl Fry for arranging it and helping me through this. It was really a pleasure for me to put together this presentation for you, and I look forward to sharing what I learned with you. The title is A.E. Palmer and the Unfinished Story of Soil Conservation on the Canadian Prairies, and this is done in collaboration with my co-author, Dr. Henry Jansen, another research scientist at the Lethbridge Research Centre. First off, I want to talk a little bit about soils. Soils are the ultimate interface, and our world is composed of a number of major components or spheres: the atmosphere or the air part, the biosphere, the living part of plants and animals, the crust of the earth, that's the mineral component of the soil. Of course, water makes everything happen, plants grow. And one that you may be less familiar with is the noosphere. That was a term coined by the great Russian geochemist Vladimir Vernadsky, and it represents the influence of the human mind on all of these. And it recognizes that human beings are now a major geological force, and it's becoming even more so as population does increase. My soil science perspective of this: soil science is the intersection of all these main components. And the story of soil erosion involves all of these spheres. 2015, I don't know how many of you are aware, has been declared International Year of Soils by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. One of the goals of this is to raise awareness about the profound importance of soil for human life. Of course, soils are crucial for food security, coping with climate change, providing ecosystem goods and services, alleviating poverty. And the goal, one of the goals is to promote sustainable management and protection of the soil's resources, so they continue to furnish our needs. And we want to advocate for soil monitoring and soil information collection, so we know what resource we have. If you want further information on this, sort of a Eurocentric view is from the Global Soil Atlas. Another place you can go to is the Soil Science Society of America, a major international science body. Now, getting right into soil formation in Western Canada, a key feature of our soils is glaciation. We've got relatively young soils. This shows the approximate years that the ice retreated. This is the ice-free corridor that is thought to be very crucial for the peopling of North America. The most recent ice age is the Wisconsin glaciation. The Laurentide ice sheet, several kilometers thick in some places, covered much of North America, and the glaciers and the glacial lakes and sediments left behind very rich soils developed into soils over the Holocene. This is a map of the major ecoregions of the North American Great Plains. And what I'm going to be focusing on is this region here. This is the North American Great Plains, that tan region. And most of my emphasis is going to be on the semi-arid prairies. This is the region where we have rainfall on the order of 250 to 450 millimeters a year. And that's distinct from the southern Great Plains. You might have heard a lot about that during the 30s and the mass migration and the hardship that was encountered in the southern plains. It's a much warmer area, and it's distinct from the temperate prairie. This is a more humid region of the grassland that enjoys more moisture than the semi-arid prairies. The semi-arid prairies has been used by human beings for a very long period of time. This is a photograph from a publication just published last month at the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It's actually the bones of a camel before they went extinct, very close to Lethbridge, it's on the shores of the St. Mary's Reservoir from 2001, where we had a drought and the water level receded. And the key thing about this skeleton is there's actually evidence of butchering by humans. So that was a resource used by human beings on the plains. Of course, that's Writing on the Stone Provincial Park in southern Alberta, and the Aboriginal people chronicled their lives by etching in the stones there. Another diagram, this is a painting by the great cowboy artist Charlie Russell, and this is his conception of what the last Indian battle between the Cree and the Blackfoot nations must have looked like. And this happened just in 1872, so a comparatively recent event. Of course, all of these cultures depended on the native prairie grasses, and that was the fuel for these economies. And of course, indirectly, the bison ate those grasses. But with the arrival of the European settlers, the bison had to go. And the plains, and a massive influence of human beings on this ecological region, it was converted into agricultural ecosystems. And this is from a publication by Glenn Padbury showing the major agricultural ecoregions in the northern Great Plains in North America. I'm going to be focusing a lot on the dark brown soils. That's where Lethbridge resides, in this region 11 here. And the brown soils, that's the more arid soils extending down into northern Montana. And then there's a bit of foothill soils. That's a little bit more humid zone in the very strong Chinook wind region of southern Alberta. In southeastern Montana and into the Dakotas, we also have a large part of the semi-arid Great Plains. It's a huge, vast area, but the percentage used as cropland is relatively small. Conversely, the brown and dark brown soils, or mollisols, in Canada account for a major fraction of the Canadian agricultural land. And these are 1999 statistics, the percentage that was under summer fallow. And I'll be talking about that a little bit more later. Another area I'd like to identify is not a very good triangle. I guess they weren't very good at geometry, but this is the Palliser Triangle. And that was delineated in the mid-1800s by Captain John Palliser, that was sent out to explore this area. and he essentially declared the area as a desert and unfit for agriculture, as distinct from a zone he called the Fertile Belt, just out of here, that might be suitable. Similar declarations were made by other explorers in the U.S. Great Plains. Another area is the dry belt. This is the most arid part, and it was identified by the geographer Vilmo. And the history of this area has been chronicled by David Jones from the University of Calgary in books such as The Empire of Dust. And there was massive migrations here in the early 1920s. And the hardship that was encountered in this area actually predated the dirty 30s that most of us are familiar with. And in some ways, it lessened the influence of the 1930s in that part of Alberta. So, Asael E. Palmer, who was this fellow? Well, there's an early picture of him. Asael was born in Salt Lake City, and he moved with his family as a teenager from actually Aurora, Utah. He probably came up to southern Alberta on a train such as this one from Great Falls into southern Alberta, and he settled with his family at Raymond, Alberta, just a little bit south of Lethbridge. When he was barely 20 years old, he took out a homestead near Turin, which is just a little bit north and east of Lethbridge. And I have the benefits of modern update soil inventory information. This is the area of his homestead, and I can tell that it's not very good soil. It's pretty coarse textured soil, and it's a little wonder why he didn't stay on as a farmer there. Shortly after this, he attended the Knight Academy in Raymond, went to high school, and that's where he met his wife-to-be, Maydell Casier. He got married in 1916, and he completed a bachelor's degree in agriculture here in Utah at the Agriculture College of Utah. The president of the college at that time was none other than John A. Widstow, and he essentially wrote the book on dry farming. And one of the problems at this time, the technology was at a fairly rudimentary stage, and there was a lot of emphasis on tillage, so much so that Jethro Tull, sort of the father of tillage technology from Europe, made it as the frontispiece in Widstow's book. And so he got his bachelor's degree, came back to Lethbridge. He was actually the principal at the Knight Academy for a little bit, and in 1921, he came on as the assistant superintendent at the Lethbridge Research Station, and I believe that that was when this photo was taken, probably. He worked a lot on soil conservation issues, and one of the most important publications was the control of soil drifting on the Canadian prairies. This publication, the first edition came out in 1935, and there was, I think, 4 editions between 35 and 1946. And one of the things that they identified is that this method of summer fallowing should be discontinued. The field should be divided into narrow strips, and it would be better if there was trash cover or plant residues on the soil surface to protect the soil from erosion. A field such as this is very prone to erosion. You can see little puffs of dust, but when the wind comes up, it proved disastrous. In 1945, he became superintendent of the research center, and this is on our wall in our facility, and of course he occupies an illustrious place as the second superintendent of our Lethbridge Research Center, is how I abbreviate it. This was a picture taken in the sort of the mid-50s, and here's Asael Palmer here with our first director, William Fairfield, and the current director of the day was Chester's, and they're in one of our very rich and highly productive irrigated cropping systems in that photo. After retirement, he had a long and productive retirement by all accounts. I love this old picture of the aircraft. So this would have been in probably the fall of 1953, and there's Asael and Maydell heading off for Pakistan, where he had a UN appointment doing similar agricultural research at a research facility in Pakistan. In 1968, he wrote a booklet. It's still used as the reference period documenting the history of soil conservation. It's called When the Winds Came, and this was printed in 1968. He continued to work with our scientists, and this is my link back. This is Dr. Chi Chang, one of my colleagues, and when he started in the late 70s, Asael was willing to help him out, and they went and they explored some old lysimeters that Asael had used. Actually, he got a Master's of Science degree from the University of Alberta in the 20s. So that gives you a little bit of history. He died in 1984, and he won many awards and accolades. He got an honorary doctorate of law degree from the University of Lethbridge in 1970, and as recently as 2005, he was named the greatest Southern Albertan of the last 100 years, and that was the centennial of the province of Alberta. So highly regarded. Now I want to go back and talk a little bit about some of his soil conservation techniques. Summer fallow. What is it? In case there may be some people not familiar with that. Summer fallow refers to annual cropland kept out of production for the entire summer season. And it was invented or discovered quite by accident, the legend of Angus Mackay and the Northwest Rebellion of 1885. At Indian Head, the Canadian Army, the young country of Canada at that time, came out, and there was a rebellion up north near Batoche, Saskatchewan, and all the horses were used to haul military gear, so they weren't available to put into crop. And by the time the rebellion was taken care of and the horses returned, it was too late to seed, so the land was just left fallow. It was tilled to keep the weeds down. The next year, 1886, was a dry year, and the crop that was seeded on those fields that had been summer fallowed produced immensely. They benefited from the more water that had been stored and carried over from the previous year. So that's the common story of how summer fallow was discovered. Originally, it was a risk management strategy to conserve moisture. Crop production was sacrificed for 1 year in favor of storing soil moisture for the succeeding year. The interval time between crops typically was 20 months. And plant growth, especially the weeds, had to be controlled during the summertime at that growing season. Otherwise, it would be of no benefit. And the problem was control of that weeds in this time period invariably made soils prone to erosion. This is a picture of what summer fallow looks, one of our long-term plots. That's a chemical fallow field. You can see the difference between the lushly growing crop and one devoid of vegetation. This is one using tillage in place of chemicals, and essentially this is a tillage tool that Palmer was involved in the development of. It's the Noble blade, and it undercuts the soil and leaves the residues on the surface. Yeah, there's another photograph just contrasting the plant growth versus the summer fallow soil, devoid of vegetation. And there's a photograph of Angus Mackay, the discoverer of summer fallow, and that's the old historic bell barn near Indian Head, which would have housed some of those horses that were used. And Angus Mackay contended that it has been proved beyond doubt that the land must be plowed if we expect to reap a crop in the following year. And this had great influence on agricultural practices on the prairies. So the next thing that happened is economics development. This is an ad that appeared in Popular Mechanics, and they're luring the settlers to the Canadian West. Prosperity awaits you in Canada, almost $1 billion in new wealth added. Unfortunately, this was added in 1915. It probably was accurate. 1915 and 1916 were really boom years. Probably not very good years to base your career on, but nonetheless, it was made for good advertising, and the settlers came. There's a photograph of the settlers arriving at Lethbridge. Most of these folks, however, came from a climate that was much more arid than the semi-arid Great Plains, and they didn't know really the farming practices to use. Enter this fellow here, Hardy Campbell from Nebraska, and he was very much a promoter. And this manual of soil culture was widely distributed and promoted by the railway companies as the method to grow grain in Western Canada. Unfortunately, it proved disastrous. One of the concepts was using a packer to pack the subsoil, but the death knell of this culture method is the advocate to create a dust mulch on the surface. And the theory was that dust mulch would slow down evaporation and help conserve moisture for the succeeding crop. The problem with that is that dust mulch was very prone to erosion. He claimed that his Campbell method for soil culture was equivalent to the camel for the Sahara Desert. And that's from the cover of his book. And his methods were promoted at congresses called the Dry Farming Congress. There was a series of those held on the Great Plains. This one was held in Lethbridge in 1912. Very important for the development of the young city of Lethbridge. The chair of a number of these conferences was none other than John Widstow from Utah, who is familiar with dry farming. But he observed that one of the great weaknesses in the work of Campbell is that he has not explained the principles underlying his practice. That's kind of a danger note right there. Nonetheless, sod busting ensued. It was the moldboard plow was the tool, but the moldboard plow wasn't just used for breaking the native prairie, it was also used for controlling weeds and vegetation during the summer fallow year. And it buried all the residues. This is a chart showing the long-term precipitation at Lethbridge. We get about 400 millimeters a year, or 16 inches. The scatter of the points give you a feel for how variable it is. It's really variable. The line is the 5-year running mean. To smooth it a little bit, it shows the dry spots and the wet spots. For growing crops, we're fortunate that we get at least half of our precipitation comes in a third of the year, and that's the growing season. So that makes it possible to grow crops over much of the semi-arid Great Plains. And there was a number of droughts. About every 25 years or so, we get some really dry spots. This is the drought of the 20s, chronicled by David Jones in his books. This is the drought of the 30s that are probably most well known. There was a short but very intense drought in '61. The 80s were dry, and then our most recent drought was in 2001. Since that time, we've enjoyed a period of some pretty moist years on the Canadian prairies. Asael Palmer's career spanned these two very devastating droughts when agriculture technology was at a comparatively rudimentary phase. And these droughts were nothing new. This shows paleoclimatic data showing the moisture that would have been received from European settlement on the Great Plains. Sometimes there was drought, sometimes there was wet years. And the prognosis of the explorers for agricultural activities depend on whether they happen to visit in a dry year or a wet spell. One of the consequences of dust mulch Campbell, as he was called, was soil drifting. And this is a photograph from Tabor, just to the east of Lethbridge this was 1939, I believe, no, 37. There's another photograph from the 30s. This shows the aftermath of a dust storm, the soil blown up in huge drifts. And that's the productive part of the land. It's been stripped off the field, impairs productivity, and it devastates farmsteads. And this is a painting done by one of the member of the Group of Seven, a famous group of Canadian painters, A.Y. Jackson. Most of them painted Ontario scenes, but we're fortunate this fellow made it out to Alberta periodically. And this is his concept of an abandoned farmyard in southern Alberta. Plowless summer fallow. What's that? Well, after the bumper crops in 1915 and 16, the homesteaders in southern Alberta started to struggle. Summer fallow seemed essential, and Campbell's dust mulch theory was questioned. In fact, it proved disastrous. In the farm press, the settlers started to debate the merits of contrasting practices. And a farmer named Rufus Kincaid Bohannon, he farmed in that dry belt, he suggested that a moldboard plow should not be used for summer fallow. And this is a very innovative and unheard of technique at the time. And this fellow probably hasn't really been given his due. He was very instrumental in reducing the use of the moldboard plow on summer fallow practices. He had a number of sons, and I actually contacted his great-granddaughter to get information in the photo. His techniques about the possibility of managing summer fallow without using a moldboard plow appeared in a lot of the farm papers, and despite dry condition, he was still able to get a crop. Even in 1925, after he had died in 1924, there's continues to be reports even by his wife as to the success of their farming methods. And this plowless summer fallow influenced Asael Palmer. Asael Palmer, digging through the archives, I also discovered that Asael Palmer had contacted the son about this practice. And in response, the son said, yes, he believes that his father was one of the first to start cultivated fallow in 1917. And Dave Bohannon further chronicles this in one of our local history books. Actually, it was hard to find because this is a much more humid region than the part of the province where it was actually used. And in the early years, plowing was a standard method of preparing summer fallow. It was slow and costly. So this was a farmer-led innovation. His father, Rufus Kincaid, and his brother were the first in their district to use the duckfoot cultivator exclusively to prepare the summer fallow. And this is a photograph. Actually, they would have used one that was drawn by horses, but this is a duckfoot cultivator. And the key feature of this is it left the residues on the soil surface to protect against erosion. There was lots of problems with this as well because it tended to clog with residues, but that was left for later development. So trash cover Palmer. When I talk to any of my soil scientist friends in the Canadian prairies, everybody's aware of at least a vague standpoint of who trash cover Palmer was and how he earned this name. When he was still principal at Knight Academy, a prominent farmer in the area consulted him on a soil drifting problem. There was an area that had been under plowless summer fallow, but it was drifting severely where the stubble had been burned. And there was an area of the field where the burning had missed and the soil was protected. It wasn't moving at all under the unburned area. And this influenced Palmer to a great extent. And later that fall, he actually took the job at the research center. So he had a major task to educate producers and other researchers to change their ways of summer fallowing. Previously, black fallow with no vegetation had been the mark of a good farmer. After all, everybody thought they needed that dust mulch. Palmer encouraged farmers to leave the stubble on the soil, and he assured people that messy-looking summer fallow with any sort of plant residue or trash cover was the key to prevent drifting. And he avoided the term stubble mulch, which was widely used in the States, to ensure there would be no connection with the dangerous dust mulch of Hardy Campbell. And there's a picture of Asael Palmer lecturing to a farm audience on proper tillage techniques. Johnson observed, this is on his, I guess it would have been his 60th wedding anniversary, he gave a little speech, and he said, he became known to farmers across the West as Trash Cover Palmer, a name he bore proudly. One of my colleagues more recently observed that, and he did a lot of work on direct seeding, a little bit different technique, not necessarily concerned with summer fallow, but Palmer became the archetype for future researchers in direct seeding systems in terms of conviction, work ethic, fostering collaboration amongst researchers, but especially innovative farmers. And he did a lot of extension work as shown in that previous photograph. He was concerned that the tests to that point in time, in the 20s, had been on small plots, so they weren't that good for testing the effects on preventing soil erosion. So he initiated a study at Lethbridge, and this is a somewhat forgotten study. I want to give you a brief sort of overview of this study. This is an aerial photo from the 40s, and this is our Lethbridge Research Center here. And this is the study I want to talk about that Palmer established. And we've got the first data from this, the first usable data was from 1929. In the winters, open winters, much like the one we just came through with very little snow and mild weather, there was severe soil erosion in the center third of the plots. And you can see it to this day. The topsoil was stripped away, and this light color here represents soil erosion. These plots were large enough that they were about 0.9 of an acre in size, so they're large enough to detect the effects of this. And Palmer instigated a number of cropping systems to explore the technologies of that day. The standard method, these were all based on a 3-year cropping system, summer fallow, usually wheat, and then usually wheat. The standard method of managing the summer fallow was with a moldboard plow. He had one method where he was looking at the effect of plowless, so he was using machinery like the duck-foot cultivator, and another couple where he was using sweet clover in place of the summer fallow. A couple of them he was using fall-seeded cereals, practice still done, and what this does is it shortens that summer fallow period from 20 months, it shortens it by 8 months, and it protects the soil because these crops are seeded in the fall and they overwinter and start regrowth in the spring. Of course, his experience at the Knight Academy and on King's Ranch, King's farm fields, he was interested in exploring the merits or not of spring burning. It's always a problem seeding wheat following wheat because you have those residues to contend with. In these clover systems, it's a biennial crop, so you mix clover seed in, it grows up, you harvest the wheat, and then that clover remains as a cover over that next winter. So it's another way to protect the soil. But you do get growth the next year. Here it can be turned in as a green manure. This yellow leguminous crop is sweet clover, Melliletus officinale, or it can be harvested as hay for livestock. This is a chart of the long-term yields, 35 years of data from 1929 through 1964, and this is the yields for the wheat on fallow. This is about 30 bushels of wheat to the acre, just for unit conversion. Not a lot of difference in the yields, maybe a little bit more variability with the winter cereals because of winter kill than the spring seeded ones. When you had sweet clover in the rotation, you didn't have a complete fallow year, so it was using some of that moisture. Summer fallow is an inherently inefficient way of storing moisture, but it makes a difference. And if you have clover on there sucking away some of your moisture, your yields are depressed in the dry years. When you have yields of wheat on wheat, this is the succeeding, always spring wheat. Again, there's not a lot of differences, but you can see by the scale, the yields are lower. Okay, so 1,500 kilograms per hectare is equivalent to about 22 bushels of wheat per acre. Not a lot of difference in the yields, depending on moisture content. Maybe in later years, a little bit benefit of including the clover on there. To look at the overall effect of this, these are the kinds of analysis that Palmer would have done, comparing these different farm technologies. He took the orange bars are the yields of wheat on fallow. This is the yield, the green bars are the yields of wheat on wheat. To look at the overall effect, you have to account for the fact that you have no yield in that summer fallow year. And essentially, he used this as evidence that, in fact, it was safe to abandon the plow, and the plow was not necessary to maintain yields. And he looked at the influence of sweet clover. There was a slight penalty from including sweet clover, but these differences really aren't very big. Sweet clover one is kind of interesting because the yields on the fallow year went down, but the yields of wheat on wheat went up. But the net effect was a little bit of a depression. The yields that you get, regardless whether it's on summer fallow or wheat following wheat, lower yields, it is dependent on the amount of moisture that you receive. So depending on the year, you got different amounts of precipitation, and these regression lines essentially show that about 45% of your variability in yield depended on the amount of precipitation that you received during the growing season from April to July, a crucial part to fuel crop production to this day. All the while this experiment was going on, there was tremendous advances in agricultural technology. One of them was the adoption of the combine harvester. This is the early days of stationary threshing machines where all the residues were removed from the field. So you have less residue there for crop production. With the adoption of the combine harvester, you're only removing the grain and the residues stay behind. There was a number of advances in tillage technology. This is the one-way plow. much more residues left behind on the soil surface than with the old moldboard plow that essentially inverted them. This is a Pacific Northwest innovation, a rod weeder, early rod weeder, and the early ones weren't very good at penetrating the soil, but there were some developments and it came to be a valuable tool as well. And at Lethbridge, the one that is most widely known, this is a prototype of the Noble Blade, and that was actually similar to that modern day cultivator that I showed earlier on. And this is very crucial because Palmer worked very closely with the farmers and the engineers that were developing these tillage tools. This came out in the latter part of the 30s in response to those windstorms that I showed, those dust storms. And essentially what they do is they undercut the weeds, but they leave the soils, the residues intact to protect the soil against erosion. In his When the Winds Came book, there is a little appendix on the history of Charles Sherwood Noble, who was a farmer and an inventor. There's been a lot of work subsequently on tillage engineering. Different tillage equipment conserves different amount of the residue. So the moldboard plow that had been popular in the Hardy Campbell days, you lost 90% of your residues after one pass. With the one-way, you lost 50%. With the Noble Blade, you only lost 10%. Another technique was chemical summer fallow. This is a monument near Havre, Montana, where they used chemical summer fallow a lot. Two of the successors of Asael Palmer were engineers, Tracy Anderson and Wayne Lindwall. There's a picture of young Wayne in a chemical fallow field, one of the earliest ones at Lethbridge, and they were instrumental in the reduction of summer fallow acreage and the development of direct seeding or no-tillage systems. That's a bit of a different story, and if you want to refer to this book, it chronicles the history of the more modern developments. Historical changes in summer fallow, there's been vast changes. In Palmer's area, summer fallow was very common. This is millions of hectares in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And it was a very common technique thought to be crucial. This is a little aberration due to grain marketing. This is when there were surpluses of grain, so people summer fallowed instead of producing grain. By this point, it was pretty apparent that summer fallow was a pretty degrading practices to our soils, and we've made remarkable advances in decreasing that practice. So we're moving to cropping continuously. This blip in summer fallow acreage is actually the happy problem of dealing with excessive moisture. Well, maybe not so happy, but that's land that was too wet to seed. And those changes in the use of summer fallow have occurred across the entire North American Great Plains, as depicted by this chart here. Now, the implications of these technological changes for soil quality can be used, and we can glean a lot of information from this old study that Asael Palmer initiated in 1929. So we've got 35 years of data of wheat on fallow yields, and we've got a subsequent period from 67 to 90, a much more recent period. Again, it's got a 2-year rotation, but still there's 12 years of wheat on fallow. There's a little bit drier period, and we can use this to assess the influence of those previous practices on soil quality. I just want to simplify the chart a little bit. This shows yields on a plot-by-plot basis, and in this subsequent time period where we had only 174 millimeters of growing season precipitation, we actually had higher yields because of advances in technology. That's a number of advances. That includes technological advances in tillage, in farm horsepower, especially in herbicides, and in crop varieties as well. These plots here were under a different rotation, so they aren't as comparable. And those low yielding years happen to coincide with years where there was only 120 millimeters. So rainfall is a major driving variable, but technology certainly has an impact as well. And the other thing we can see is that these plots that had sweet clover in this early period, during the periods from 67 to 90, they benefited from those old sweet clover plots. That's an input of nitrogen, which is very crucial for agriculture on the North American Great Plains. A large part of our Our cropland receives nitrogen fertilizer. We do a lot of work on trying to ensure that that's managed in a sound manner. This benefit from that clover, by this time the native fertility, the native nitrogen fertility of our soils has been exhausted, and if we continue to export wheat, a high protein, high nitrogen product with nitrogen in it, we're going to have to supplement our soils with nitrogen. Agriculture, alas, is not a perpetual motion machine. Erosion and productivity, we're coming on the end here. This would have been a chart. I can imagine Asael Palmer using this in some of his talks to the producers, Trash Cover Palmer, exhorting them to use practices to prevent erosion. This shows the nice, lush wheat crop growing on the area that had only slight soil drifting, and this is wheat from the same field that was growing on badly drifted soil. And this is that erosion that happened in 1925-26. In 1998, I think I can see a light band there in these cultural plots. It's still there, and we can measure that as a slight decrease in the soil carbon content, organic carbon content. And actually, in the early days, they did measure yields on the eroded versus the non-eroded strip. And in the very early days, they did see huge differences in yields between those. It depends whether it's wheat on fallow or wheat following wheat. But there was a large difference, and then that difference shrunk in 1930. We can go back to those same plots, and I fortuitously have data from some subsequent work looking at the difference between those yields. There still is a little bit of a difference maybe, but it's very small. So this demonstrates the resilience of our soils. And soil resilience is a very crucial feature of our agricultural systems. When I say soil resilience, I'm referring to the ability of a soil to bounce back in response to external stresses. This can be a variety of stresses, including the erosive forces of wind, water, tillage machinery, adverse environmental conditions such as drought, changing atmospheric compositions, chemical and biological pollutants, imbalanced nutrient cycling, and the like. Essentially, soil resilience is concerned with maintaining a normal function to sustain the required flow of ecological goods and services from our land. There's lots of questions that we're facing. Can we use our land to produce biofuels? What if they implement cellulosic biofuels where they're using our residues to produce fuel? Agricultural systems that are durable, renewable, or sustainable depend on resilient soils. It's an absolutely crucial feature of our agricultural systems, and I'm afraid that the work on that isn't done. Steinbeck said it very eloquently in East of Eden. He said that it never failed that during the dry years, the people forgot about the rich years, and during the wet years, they lost all memories of the dry years. It was always that way. And sometimes there's a tendency for people to be complacent about protecting our soil resource. They think that we have all the answers and we're done with this. I'm afraid there's new challenges evolving in agriculture all the time. This is a more recent photograph of a farmer actually very near where Bohannon farmed, in Alsace, Saskatchewan. And this was taken in 2004. Obviously, he's got some drifted soil that's filled almost to the top of his stubble. And he's very concerned about climate change, this particular gentleman. So clearly we aren't finished yet. And to close the talk, I would like to leave you with some words of Trash Cover Palmer himself. He wrote this for a magazine article in 1949, and they asked him to write an article on if the dry years come again, what are we going to do? And in the opening of this manuscript, this draft manuscript, I'd like to point out that Palmer observed what we really should be thinking about is what will happen when the dry years come again. And so, with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I hope we might have a few minutes to entertain a question or two, if there are any.
Take a couple of questions before we get to 10 minutes to the hour. I'm sure some of you will need to leave, but even after that, he will be around for a time if you have some special questions. So any questions, queries at this time? Comments?
Yes.
I'm just curious if you guys are looking at this issue of using cattle grazing on these lands to help restore the quality of the soil.
You might repeat that question.
Yes, the question was, are we using cattle grazing to restore the productivity of the soil? And I would say a qualified yes. Our research center at Lethbridge, actually the soils component is a very small component of the research center. We've got a lot of people working on beef cattle, and it's especially the cow-calf industry in southern Alberta that's absolutely crucial. We hear a lot of bad press about beef production and how we're supposed to be eating lower on the food chain. I regard beef cattle as absolutely crucial to protect our soils resource because we have a vast area of agricultural land that's not annual cropland, and the only suitable use for that right now is cattle grazing. And cattle grazing is compatible with a lot of other ecological goods and services that all of us take for granted. Services like buffering the watershed, being a big sponge to buffet the effects of heavy rainstorm, sequestering carbon and trying to scrub out some methane and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So yes, the cattle resource certainly is an essential part of agriculture too.
At the very first, you had your big screen filled with the different phases that you're studying, glaciation being one of them. And I wondered what Canada's stand on warming of the continent. Do you feel that our weather patterns are changing? Have they always had the dips and valleys? And you know, how does your study work in with that at all?
Yes, the question was the chart of the glaciations. The glaciations came and receded, and in geological time, that was a fairly recent event. And of course, there's lots of concern, and especially here in the States, there's lots of questions about California. I think people are worried whether this is a human-caused factor or whether it is or whether it's just natural variability. And I guess I'm afraid I don't feel qualified to give a really definitive or satisfactory answer about that. I know that there has been fluctuations in the past. You can see those proxy data. There's been very severe droughts. And what makes me concerned is a lot of times people get up in arms about a drought and a dry period in Western Canada. And when you look at the history, there's been lots of dry periods in the past. And we have no good reason to expect that we won't encounter those in the future. And I'm not a climatologist. I do study atmospheric chemistry, and I do know that the atmospheric composition certainly is changing, and I am convinced that there are human fingerprints all over those changes in atmospheric composition. But the linkages between atmospheric composition and the climate in general, I don't have answers for that. I don't feel qualified.
Why are they not doing summer fallow as much anymore?
They aren't doing summer fallow as much anymore for two main reasons. One is economic. It's more profitable to reduce to a bare minimum the amount of summer fallow you have in your cropping system. And the second reason is it is better for the environment. You have less prone to erosion and soil degradation and nutrient leakage and other negative consequences of summer fallowing. So that's why there's been a big push and reduction in that. So both economic and environment. It's sort of a win-win scenario that we don't come across very often. And there's been a lot of technological changes that has facilitated that transition. And Palmer is recognized, Trask Cover Palmer is recognized for laying some of the foundations for that.
Well, we're out of time. Would you please join with me thanking Dr. Ellert for his presentation?